Well, I think the one thing I don't think they're going to do is cut rates into deeper negative territory at this stage. While I think the BOJ still remains confident actually in the long-term effectiveness of this negative rate policy, we all know how adverse the market's reaction has been, and also really has not played well with the average Japanese household. Lots of complaints in the latest Cabinet Office Eco Watcher survey that negative rates are threatening households' deposits. So I think it's a very sensitive time for the BOJ, and rate cuts are unlikely to revive sentiment nor be a boost to markets. So I think he's going to hold off. But I do think a big response is coming at the April 28th monetary policy meeting. We're probably going to get another downgrade of the board's GDP and CPI forecast at that stage. And I think inaction will be very hard to justify on Kuroda-san's part. I think the next move from the Bank of Japan will be a very aggressive expansion in risk asset purchases. I think Kuroda-san is very keen to demonstrate that he is not hitting the limits with this QQE program, the QE side of things. And I think he's going to announce a quantum leap, a 10 trillion yen increase in equity purchases.
To be fair on Kuroda-san, isn't it a bit too early in the current cycle to write off NERP? It takes time to cycle through the system. There's always a lag time associated with policy, especially new policy, especially unorthodox policy like this. Given time, shouldn't we see the impact on pricing at some point during the cycle, Izumi?
Well, I think in the case of negative rates policies, I don't think, I think the market's very big reaction probably was not justified. We're talking about still a fairly small cut. And, it's not going to feed through into money market rates in a really big way at this level of negative rates. But I don't really think Kuroda-san has the luxury of time, actually. If you look at the economic indicators for January and February that we have so far, they're not looking good. I think there's a bit of a crisis of confidence actually in the Bank of Japan, in their ability to help turn sentiment around. So I'm not saying, it all falls on the shoulders of the central bank governor. I think we're also going to have to get more forceful response on the fiscal policy side, including consideration of a postponement of the next VAT hike. So all of it's going to come in terms of a more coordinated, I think, fiscal and monetary response before the upper house elections.
David? Yeah, Izumi, I mean, don't you think that the ECB has actually stolen Kuroda's thunder a little? I mean, Kuroda thought he brought out a bazooka, right? I mean, there's a wonderful scene in Crocodile Dundee where Crocodile Dundee and Linda Kozlowski, yeah,
yes,
were being held up. And the guy brings out a penknife. And then Crocodile Dundee says to the robber, "You call that a knife? This is a knife." And I think, this is a bit like this at the moment. The ECB is saying to the Bank of Japan, "You call that a knife? This is a knife." And then I think Kuroda's got to actually do something even bigger now, because otherwise he's going to actually sort of lose this race to the bottom.
Yeah, no, but I think that actually the ECB's actions are meaningful, but in a slightly different, I interpret it in a slightly different way. I mean, we see the ECB's move, essentially announcing that they've hit the bottom with negative rates as a move that they're emphasizing less the, FX transmission mechanism and more on credit easing channel, which actually is a bit of the ECB throwing up its hands and say, look, we've taken this currency war thing too far. We think it's now more important to stoke domestic demand by nurturing bank lending. So that actually is a bit of, I think it is a bit of a problem for the Bank of Japan, because you had, essentially in January, the Bank of Japan went all in negative interest rates, but here's the ECB kind of saying it's over. So it does put pressure on Kuroda-san, but I think it actually forces him to look at the, quantitative and qualitative dimensions of QQE more.
Izumi, can we get into the ornithology of the policy board at the Bank of Japan? And am I right in suggesting that the board will have a more dovish complexion towards July when Shirai and Ishida, their term expires?
Yeah, absolutely. Shirai-san and Ishida-san were opposed to additional easing in the past. Shirai-san's term actually expires after this meeting, so even in April, I think Kuroda-san will have a bigger majority to work with. I actually never thought that the composition of the board was necessarily an impediment to Governor Kuroda's ability to deliver further easing, but I do think he'd be happier with a bigger majority, so that's definitely a push in a more dovish direction.